Maya Williams had always been good at reading people, but she'd never needed the skill more than she did now. Standing in the marble-floored lobby of Blackstone Industries, watching a room full of adults pretend a 12-year-old girl didn't exist. The girl sat alone on a leather bench, her expensive clothes and careful posture screaming privilege, but her eyes held something Maya recognized from her own childhood. The particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who refuse to see you. What made it worse was how they actively looked away when the girl tried to communicate with her hands, their discomfort palpable as they turned their backs or suddenly found their phones fascinating. Maya had come here for a job interview, but watching this unfold she felt something shift inside her chest. The girl's father, because it had to be her father, given the identical stubborn set of their jaws, stood 20 feet away in an animated conversation with 3 suit-wearing executives, occasionally glancing at his daughter, with the kind of guilty concern that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd left her isolated like this. Maya approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, and when she was close enough, she lifted her hands and signed a simple greeting. The transformation on the girl's face was immediate and startling, like someone had just turned on a light switch in a dark room. Her name was Lily Blackstone, she signed back with eager, rapid movements, and she'd been sitting here for 45 minutes, waiting for her father to finish his meeting. No one had spoken to her, not even the receptionist who'd offered her water with exaggerated lip movements and pointed gestures that made Lily want to disappear into the expensive furniture. Maya settled beside her on the bench, introducing herself as someone who was here for an interview, but finding this conversation far more interesting than any job could be. Lily's signing grew more animated as she explained that her father owned the building, owned half the city really, but somehow that wealth couldn't buy her what she wanted most. People who would talk to her like she was a normal kid, instead of treating her deafness like something contagious. They were deep in a conversation about Lily's school when Richard Blackstone finally approached, his expression cycling through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been relief, as he watched his daughter laugh at something Maya had signed. He introduced himself with the kind of firm handshake that rich men use to assert dominance, but his voice carried genuine gratitude when he thanked Maya for keeping Lily company. Maya studied his face as he spoke, noting the expensive watch, the perfect haircut, the way his employees hovered at a respectful distance waiting for his attention, but also the tired lines around his eyes, and the way he looked at his daughter with a love so fierce it was almost painful to witness. When he asked if Maya knew sign language professionally, she explained about her younger brother who'd been born deaf, how she'd learned alongside him, how it had become as natural as breathing. What she didn't mention was how watching Lily sit alone had transported her back 15 years to every school function, every family gathering, every public space where David had been made to feel invisible by people too uncomfortable with difference to make an effort. Lily tugged on her father's sleeve and began signing rapidly, her excitement evident even to someone who couldn't understand the language, and Maya watched Richard's face transform as he followed his daughter's hands. He was fluent, she realized with surprise. This wasn't a father who'd failed to learn his child's language, which made the situation in the lobby even more puzzling. Why surround yourself with people who couldn't communicate with your daughter? Why bring her to a place where she'd inevitably be isolated? Richard seemed to read the questions in Maya's expression, because he gestured toward his office, asking if she had time to talk. Maya glanced at her watch. Her interview wasn't for another hour, and honestly, this family had already captured her curiosity in a way that the marketing coordinator position never could. Richard's office occupied a corner of the 32nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that probably cost more than most people's houses. Lily immediately claimed a chair at the conference table, pulling out homework with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to occupying herself in adult spaces. Richard poured coffee from an expensive machine, his movements careful and deliberate, and Maya got the impression he was buying time to figure out how to explain something complicated. When he finally spoke, the corporate Polish fell away, revealing a father who was running out of options. The custody battle had been going on for 3 years, he explained, ever since his ex-wife decided that Lily's deafness was something that needed to be fixed rather than accommodated. Victoria believed that cochlear implants and intensive speech therapy would give Lily a normal life, never mind that Lily had explicitly said she didn't want to be fixed because she didn't believe she was broken. The divorce had been bitter enough, but when Victoria remarried a doctor who specialized in pediatric audiology, the pressure on Lily had intensified to the point where she'd started having nightmares and panic attacks. Richard had fought for primary custody and won. But Victoria wasn't giving up. She'd hired investigators to document every moment of Lily's life, looking for evidence that Richard was limiting her potential by allowing her to use sign language as her primary communication method. Every interaction, every social situation, every moment where Lily seemed isolated or different, was being catalogued as proof that Richard was failing as a father. The people in his office, the executives and employees who worked for him, had been coached by lawyers to interact with Lily in ways that would look good if photographed or recorded, which meant treating her like a normal hearing child, speaking to her normally, avoiding sign language that might be interpreted as evidence that Richard was keeping her trapped in deaf culture instead of helping her integrate into the hearing world. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach as the implications became clear. Richard was essentially forcing his daughter to be misunderstood and isolated in order to protect his custody rights, creating exactly the kind of environment that would damage her emotionally while trying to prove he was a good father. It was a legal catch-22 that seemed designed to harm the very child everyone claimed to be protecting. Lily looked up from her homework, signing something to her father that made his jaw tighten. Maya caught enough to understand that Lily was asking if she could stay and talk more, that she liked having someone who understood her without having to pretend to be something she wasn't. Richard's response was gentle but firm. Maya had an interview to get to and they couldn't take up more of her time. But as Maya stood to leave, something made her pause. Maybe it was the way Lily's face fell, or the defeated set of Richard's shoulders, or her own memories of watching David navigate a world that saw his deafness as a problem to be solved, rather than a difference to be respected. She turned back toward Richard's desk, and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of leaving for her interview, she asked if Richard was hiring for any positions that might involve working with Lily. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and Maya pressed on, explaining that she had a master's degree in communications, experience in public relations, and, most importantly, a deep understanding of what it meant to advocate for someone in a world that didn't always want to listen. She could help him navigate this impossible situation, she suggested, not by hiding Lily's deafness, but by reframing the narrative entirely. What if instead of trying to prove Lily could function in a hearing world, they demonstrated how much richer the world became when it learned to function with Lily? Richard studied her for a long moment, and Maya could practically see him calculating risks and possibilities. Hiring someone specifically to work with his daughter could be seen as evidence that Lily needed special accommodation, which might support Victoria's argument. But continuing to isolate her was clearly causing harm, and the current strategy of pretending everything was normal obviously wasn't working. Lily had been following the conversation through their expressions and body language, and now she signed something that made Richard's decision for him. Maya caught the gist, something about being tired of pretending and wanting to be herself. Richard nodded slowly and asked Maya if she could start immediately, not as an employee but as a consultant, someone who could help him figure out how to protect his daughter without sacrificing her happiness in the process. Maya's interview for the marketing position could wait. She'd just found something far more important to do. The next morning, Maya arrived at Blackstone Industries with a plan that felt equal parts brilliant and terrifying. She'd spent most of the night researching custody law, deaf advocacy, and the specific arguments Victoria's legal team was likely to use against Richard. What she'd discovered was both encouraging and infuriating. While Victoria's doctors could argue that sign language limited Lily's potential, there was substantial research showing that bilingual deaf children actually outperformed their peers in cognitive development, creative thinking, and social adaptability. The problem wasn't Lily's use of sign language, it was the hearing world's refusal to meet her halfway. Maya's first stop was the employee break room, where she'd arranged to meet with Richard's assistant, Margaret, a woman who'd worked for the company for 15 years and had watched Lily grow up in this building. Margaret was initially resistant to Maya's suggestions, explaining that Mr. Blackstone had been very clear about how staff should interact with his daughter, but Maya pressed gently, asking how it felt to watch a child sit alone in the lobby while adults walk past her like she was invisible. The question hit its mark, and Margaret admitted that the whole situation made her uncomfortable, that she'd wanted to learn some basic signs but had been discouraged by the legal team who worried it would look like the company was treating Lily as disabled rather than capable. Maya spent an hour teaching Margaret simple signs for hello, thank you, and how are you. Watching the older woman's face light up as she realized how easy it was to make basic connection across the language barrier. When Lily arrived after school, Maya positioned herself in the lobby, and waited to see what would happen. Margaret approached Lily's bench with obvious nervousness, but when she signed a careful hello and asked how Lily's day had been, the girl's surprised delight was worth every risk Maya was taking. Their conversation was halting and simple, but it was real communication, and Maya noticed several other employees stopping to watch with interest rather than discomfort. By the end of the week, Maya had quietly taught basic signs to 6 staff members, framing it not as special accommodation for a disabled child, but as professional development. Learning to communicate with clients and colleagues in multiple languages was a valuable skill in an increasingly diverse business world. The transformation in the office atmosphere was subtle but noticeable. Instead of avoiding Lily, or treating her with careful politeness, people began including her in casual interactions, asking about her homework, sharing jokes that worked in visual language. Richard watched these changes with a mixture of hope and anxiety, clearly torn between wanting his daughter to be accepted and fearing that Victoria's investigators would interpret the signing employees as evidence that Lily couldn't function in a normal workplace. Maya understood his concern, but she was building towards something bigger than just making Lily more comfortable in her father's office. She was documenting every interaction, every moment of connection, every instance where Lily's presence enhanced rather than complicated the workplace dynamic. When Richard's business partner James Morrison visited from the Chicago office, Maya saw her opportunity to test the larger strategy. James was the kind of man who treated children like small, incompetent adults, speaking to them in the same patronizing tone he used with junior employees, and Maya watched him struggle through an awkward interaction with Lily that left both of them frustrated. Later, when James was complaining to Richard about the difficulty of communicating with his daughter, Maya stepped in with a suggestion that was part diplomatic intervention and part calculated risk. She offered to teach James enough sign language to have a basic conversation with Lily, framing it as a way to strengthen his partnership with Richard by showing respect for his family. James was skeptical until Maya mentioned that sign language was increasingly valuable in business settings, that several major corporations were requiring basic ASL training for customer service roles, and that being able to communicate across language barriers was a marketable skill that could set their company apart from competitors. The lesson went better than Maya had dared hope, partly because James was competitive enough to want to master anything that might give him an advantage, and partly because Lily was patient and encouraging with his clumsy attempts at fingerspelling. When James successfully signed his first complete sentence asking about Lily's favorite subject in school, her enthusiastic response and genuine smile seemed to shift something fundamental in his attitude. He began asking questions about deaf culture, about the logistics of raising a bilingual child, about the ways that Lily's perspective might actually be advantageous in certain situations. Maya seized the opportunity to share some of her research about deaf entrepreneurs and innovators, about the heightened visual processing skills that often developed in deaf individuals, about the way that navigating between languages and cultures created cognitive flexibility that was increasingly valuable in global business environments. By the time James left for Chicago, he was talking about implementing basic sign language training across both offices, not as accommodation but as competitive advantage. Richard seemed stunned by the transformation, but Maya could see him beginning to understand the larger strategy she was building. Instead of hiding Lily's deafness or treating it as something to be overcome, they were going to reframe it as an asset, demonstrating that accommodating different communication styles didn't weaken a business, but strengthened it by expanding its capacity to connect with diverse clients and communities. The real test came 2 weeks later when Victoria arrived unannounced for one of her court-mandated visits with Lily. Maya had been expecting this moment, had prepared for it, but watching Victoria sweep into the building with her new husband and a court-appointed observer still sent adrenaline shooting through her system. Victoria was exactly what Maya had expected, impeccably dressed, perfectly composed, and radiating the kind of cold determination that came from absolute certainty that she was right. Dr. Stephen Walsh, her husband, followed a step behind, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes taking in every detail of the environment with clinical assessment. Maya watched from across the lobby as Victoria approached Lily, speaking in clear, exaggerated lip movements while gesturing for her daughter to respond verbally. Lily's body language went rigid with stress, her hands moving instinctively into signs that Victoria quickly pressed down, shaking her head with disappointed disapproval. The observer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a legal pad, noted everything, and Maya could see the exact moment when Victoria's strategy became clear. She was documenting Lily's reliance on sign language as evidence of limited development, treating every gesture as proof that Richard was failing to help his daughter reach her potential in the hearing world. What Victoria hadn't counted on was walking into an environment where sign language was treated as an asset rather than a limitation. Margaret approached the group and greeted Victoria politely before turning to Lily and signing a warm hello, asking how her day had been, and commenting on her new backpack. Other employees passing through the lobby waved to Lily or paused to sign quick greetings, treating her exactly like they would any other colleague's child they'd gotten to know over the years. Victoria's careful composure cracked slightly as she realized that the narrative she'd expected to find, isolated child struggling to communicate in hearing world, was nowhere in evidence. Instead, she was witnessing a bilingual child moving fluidly between languages depending on her conversation partner, switching from signs with Margaret to written notes with the security guard who was still learning, to spoken words with the facilities manager who was hard of hearing herself and appreciated the visual support. Dr. Walsh began asking questions about the employees' sign language training, clearly looking for evidence of special accommodation that could support their case. But Maya was ready for this too. She approached the group and introduced herself as a communications consultant who'd been working with Blackstone Industries on diversity and inclusion initiatives. The sign language training, she explained, was part of a broader effort to create more inclusive business practices, something that was becoming standard across progressive companies who wanted to serve diverse client bases effectively. When Dr. Walsh pressed for specifics about why sign language training was necessary, Maya smoothly redirected the conversation to the business advantages they'd already seen. Employees reported improved spatial awareness and visual processing skills, better ability to communicate in noisy environments or across language barriers with international clients, and enhanced team cohesion from learning new skills together. Several staff members had already used their basic signing skills with deaf customers or family members, creating positive experiences that translated into business success and community goodwill. Victoria tried to steer the conversation back to Lily's needs and limitations, but every attempt was undercut by the evidence around her. This wasn't a child being accommodated despite her disability. This was a child whose bilingual skills were valued and respected in an environment that had adapted to include her rather than requiring her to change to fit in. When Richard finally joined the group, Maya watched him navigate the interaction with new confidence. Instead of defending his choices or apologizing for his daughter's communication style, he spoke proudly about Lily's role in helping the company develop more inclusive practices, about the creative problem-solving skills she'd developed from navigating between languages, about the leadership qualities she was showing by teaching others and advocating for herself. The observer scribbled notes rapidly, and Maya caught enough of her expressions to know that what she was documenting wasn't matching Victoria's narrative about a child being held back by permissive parenting and accommodation-focused environment. The custody hearing 3 months later felt like the culmination of everything Maya had been building toward, but walking into that courtroom still made her stomach clench with anxiety. She wasn't testifying, her role was supposed to be behind the scenes. But she'd helped Richard's legal team prepare their case, and watching it unfold felt intensely personal. Victoria's attorney opened with exactly the arguments Maya had expected, painting Richard as a father who was prioritizing political correctness over his daughter's future, allowing her to remain trapped in a limited deaf world, instead of pushing her toward the independence that cochlear implants and speech therapy could provide. Dr. Walsh testified about the latest advances in pediatric audiology, about success rates for children who received early intervention, about the importance of integration into mainstream hearing society for long-term educational and career success. It was a compelling presentation, backed by medical credentials and genuine concern, and Maya could see some of the jury members nodding along with the logic. But then, Richard's attorney began presenting their counter-narrative, starting with Lily herself. At 13, she was old enough for her preferences to carry weight with the court, and watching her take the witness stand was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She'd chosen to testify in spoken English, a strategic decision that demonstrated her bilingual capabilities, while allowing her to control the pace and clarity of her communication. Her voice was careful and deliberate, with the slight tonal variations common in deaf speakers, but every word was clear and purposeful. She explained that she didn't want cochlear implants because she wasn't broken, that sign language wasn't a limitation, but a strength that allowed her to communicate with a broader range of people than most hearing individuals could reach. She talked about her friends at school, both deaf and hearing, about her academic performance which consistently ranked in the top 10% of her class, about her goals for college and career that included using her bilingual skills to bridge communication gaps in business or diplomatic settings. When Victoria's attorney pressed her about the advantages that full hearing might provide, Lily's response was both mature and devastating. She explained that her deafness wasn't something that held her back but something that gave her unique perspectives and abilities, that the real barriers she faced came not from her inability to hear, but from other people's discomfort with difference. She described the loneliness of being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood, the frustration of having adults make decisions about her body and future without respecting her own voice in those choices. Maya watched the jury as Lily spoke, noting the shift in their expressions from polite attention to genuine engagement, several of them leaning forward as they absorbed this articulate young woman's testimony about autonomy, identity, and the difference between accommodation and inspiration. Richard's attorney then called a series of witnesses that Maya had helped identify and prepare. Margaret testified about the positive changes in workplace culture, since employees had learned basic sign language, describing improved communication across all areas, and increased sensitivity to diverse client needs. James Morrison flew in from Chicago to explain how the company's inclusivity training had expanded their market reach and enhanced their reputation in the business community. Two of Lily's teachers spoke about her academic performance and social development, emphasizing that her bilingual abilities were accelerating rather than limiting her learning. A deaf college student who'd been mentoring Lily talked about the career possibilities available to bilingual deaf individuals, the leadership roles she'd observed Lily taking in mixed deaf and hearing groups, the confidence and advocacy skills that suggested this was a young person who would thrive in whatever environment she chose to pursue. But the testimony that seemed to impact the jury most powerfully came from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a developmental psychologist who specialized in deaf and hard-of-hearing children. Maya had found Dr. Rodriguez through her research, a respected expert whose credentials matched Dr. Walsh's, but whose philosophy differed dramatically. Dr. Rodriguez testified that the current research supported bilingual approaches to deaf education, that children who were fluent in both sign language and spoken/written English showed enhanced cognitive flexibility, creative problem-solving abilities, and cultural competence that served them well throughout their lives. More importantly, she explained, the psychological research was clear, that children who were supported in developing positive deaf identity rather than being pressured to minimize or eliminate their deafness, showed better mental health outcomes, stronger self-advocacy skills, and greater resilience in facing accessibility challenges. When Victoria's attorney challenged Dr. Rodriguez about the limitations that deafness might impose on career choices, her response was swift and well documented. She cited deaf doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, entrepreneurs and artists who had achieved success not despite their deafness but often because of the unique perspectives and skills their sensory experience had developed. The goal of parenting a deaf child, she argued, wasn't to make them as much like hearing children as possible, but to help them develop all of their capabilities, while building strong identity and self-advocacy skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Maya could see Victoria's confidence wavering as the testimony continued, particularly when Dr. Rodriguez addressed the elephant in the room, the assumption that parents who supported sign language use were somehow limiting their children's potential. She explained that research consistently showed bilingual deaf children outperforming monolingual peers in academic achievement, social development, and later career success, that the choice wasn't between sign language or spoken language, but between bilingual competence or artificial limitation. When the court recessed for lunch, Maya found herself in the hallway watching Lily interact with the crowd of supporters Richard had brought. Extended family members, friends, teachers and co-workers had come to show their support, and Maya noticed how naturally Lily moved between different communication styles depending on her conversation partner. She signed with her deaf mentor, spoke aloud with her hearing aunt, wrote notes for an elderly family friend who was losing his hearing, and switched fluidly between modes when multiple people were involved in group conversations. It was a perfect demonstration of the bilingual competence everyone had been testifying about, but more than that, it showed a confident young person who had learned to navigate different social environments without compromising her identity or limiting her connections. Victoria stood apart from this group, talking quietly with Dr. Walsh and her legal team, and Maya could see the strain beginning to show in her perfect composure. This wasn't the narrative she'd expected to face in court, and the evidence was mounting that her approach to Lily's deafness was based more on her own discomfort than on her daughter's actual needs or limitations. The afternoon session focused on expert testimony about custody arrangements and child welfare, but Maya could tell that the real decision had already been made. The judge's questions focused more on practical arrangements than fundamental philosophy, more on ensuring Lily's continued access to both parents than on determining which approach to her deafness was superior. When Richard's attorney presented their final argument, Maya felt like she was watching the conclusion of a story she'd helped write. Instead of defending Richard's parenting choices, they celebrated Lily's achievements and potential, demonstrating how she'd thrived in an environment that respected her bilingual identity, while supporting her growth in all areas. Instead of arguing against cochlear implants or medical intervention, they emphasized that those decisions should be made by Lily herself, in consultation with her parents and medical team, when she was ready to make informed choices about her own body and future. The judge's ruling, delivered 2 weeks later, felt both inevitable and miraculous. Primary custody remained with Richard, with expanded visitation rights for Victoria, but specific stipulations that Lily's communication preferences and identity development should be respected by both parents. The ruling explicitly stated that sign language use was not evidence of limitation but of bilingual competence, and that any future decisions about medical intervention should prioritize Lily's own informed consent rather than parental preference. Maya wasn't in the courtroom when the decision was read, but Richard called her immediately afterward, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked her for everything she'd done. What she'd accomplished, he said, was more than just winning a custody case. She'd helped him understand how to be a better father to a daughter whose needs were different from what he'd expected, but no less valuable or important. 3 months later, Maya officially joined Blackstone Industries as Director of Inclusive Communication, a position created specifically to expand on the work she'd started. Her office was down the hall from Richard's, with a clear view of the lobby, where she'd first seen Lily sitting alone. Now that same space buzzed with employees practicing sign language during lunch breaks, deaf and hard of hearing clients meeting with staff who could communicate effectively across language barriers, and Lily herself holding court with a group of interns she was teaching basic fingerspelling. The transformation felt both dramatic and completely natural, as if the building had simply remembered how to be welcoming to everyone instead of just some people. Maya's official responsibilities included developing accessibility protocols, training staff in inclusive communication practices, and serving as a liaison with deaf and hard of hearing community organizations. But her favorite part of the job remained the informal moments when she could watch Lily navigate her world with confidence and competence. The girl who had once sat silently in the lobby, ignored by adults too uncomfortable to try connecting with her, now moved through the building like she owned it, which, Maya supposed, she actually did. Victoria still visited regularly, and while their relationship remained complicated, Maya had noticed subtle changes in how she interacted with Lily. She'd started learning basic signs herself, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, but Maya chose to interpret this as progress, rather than victory. The goal had never been to prove Victoria wrong, but to create space for Lily to be fully herself, while maintaining relationships with both parents. Some battles were won through confrontation, but the most important victories came from expanding everyone's understanding of what was possible when you stopped trying to fix people and started learning how to meet them where they were. Maya kept the business card from her original interview in her desk drawer, a reminder of the day her life had taken an unexpected turn towards something more meaningful than she'd ever imagined. She'd come to Blackstone Industries looking for a marketing job, but she'd found something better, a chance to help rewrite the story about what it meant to be different, in a world that too often demanded conformity. Every morning when she arrived at work and saw Lily chatting with the security guard in sign language, or watched Margaret confidently interpreting for a deaf client, or noticed the easy inclusion that had become standard practice throughout the company, Maya felt the satisfaction of work that mattered beyond quarterly profits or performance reviews. She'd helped create an environment where a brilliant, bilingual, confident young woman could thrive without compromising any part of who she was, and in doing so had made the whole world a little bit more accessible for everyone.